Hello everybody, in this workshop run with Derwent and Cult pens I'm going to be showing you how to use Derwent Inktense Excel blocks to make something like this. We're going to launch straight in there. I'm going to go down to my paper. Hopefully you can still see me here. We've also got the wonderful Inej, who is going to be our very still model from photo reference down there, but Inej is a friend of mine and is delighted to be posing virtually for you all today. And then I've got this drawing on my paper here. So this was made using the Inktense Excel blocks. This is the original of the commission that ended up on the tin there. And we're going to look at making a simplified version of this. So I thought I'd start off just by showing you that. Also, it's helpful often to see the scale. So that's against my hand there. I'm just going to take that, pop it aside for the minute, and just show you everything you're going to need to take part in today's session if you're following along with me exactly. Do feel free to ad lib with other materials you have to hand if you don't have everything that I'm going to show you. So just to start off, I've got the Inktense Excel block 12 set here. So this is the big one. You actually don't need all of these for today's workshop, but it just looks so pretty. I thought I'd show everyone. It's like a kind of treasure chest of jewels or something. So we've got the big blocks in here, and I'm going to introduce those properly in a moment. So if you happen to have the 12 set, that's a wonderful bonus. I'm going to pop that off to the side though, and I'm just going to be using 3 colors, just red, blue, and yellow from the 6 set tin here. So that's the one with this cover. So I'm just going to pop that off to the side, and I'll take one of these out just so that you can see it a little bit better. So if you haven't come across one of the Excel blocks, Derwent do a range of different Excel blocks, charcoal, graphite, but these Inktense ones, they are brand new and they are very exciting. I was really delighted to get the advanced tins on these and to be able to have a play around with them early on. So if you're familiar with Inktense pencils, they basically contain the same material as the Inktense block, so you'll be able to use them together. There's about 8 pencils worth of material in one of those big blocks, so it's like a gigantic block of Inktense material. So I'll pop that there. You're not going to need one of these pencils, but just for demonstration purposes, it's there. But if we're using one of those, they are water soluble. So it's one of the main properties of the Inktense blocks that they're water soluble. So I'm going to be using them with water. So I've just got this little water brush here that I'm going to be using. It's one of the Derwent push button ones. So just to open one up, you've got the little nylon tip there, and then it feeds water when you press the button through to the tip. So that's going to be a handy little thing to use. You could use any brush. So any brush that you've got to hand is going to be suitable for it. So feel free to use any brush that you've got, but that's what I'm going to use. I'm also going to have 2 jars of water. The reason I've got 2, so I've just got one there and one here, is that I'm going to have one. So I'm going to use the big one here just to wash my brush in. And then I've got this one just to add a little bit more water in when I need it. And I'm going to keep that as a separate clean jar so that I can switch between cleaning old paint off with one water pot and then adding new water in with clean water there. So I'll just pop those to the side as well.
Jake, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. There's just a comment come through. Sorry. One of the participants has said they can just make out the black block, but can you possibly go through the names of the other color blocks, please?
Oh, yes, I certainly can. So if I just go through just quickly from the top, so we've got the poppy red. So this one's here. We've got the sun yellow. So that's the yellow at the top. So if I just put that back in, then if I just come up a little bit close to the camera, you'll see there's the bright blue there. And then we've got, oh, it's actually quite tricky to see there. The field green that we have, ink black, and then we've got an antique white at the bottom. So that's sun yellow, poppy red, bright blue, field green, and then ink black, and then the antique white. So that's in the 6 set there. Hope that's okay for everyone. Hope that's right for you, Lisa, as well. That was a good moment to interrupt because it was very boring. I was just introducing some kitchen roll, which I've got just to clean my brush off on. So that's not super exciting. One fun thing that I have got, which you might not have, and which you don't necessarily need, is a tiny grater. So this is like a little nutmeg grater, a little miniature one that I'm going to actually use to grate the block. I also use a craft knife for this quite often, so to scrape things off of the block. You could use any kind of hard tool, even the edge of a steel ruler or something can work very well. So to get started, absolute basics, it will be helpful to have the Excel block and some kind of brush, water, and something to clean that brush off on. So just a little bit of kitchen roll like this. That will sort you out perfectly. So I'm just going to pop those off to the side as well. And we're going to actually first have a little play around with some abstract mark making on paper. Now, the paper is quite important. You want something, as we're going to be using water-soluble material, so I'm just going to bring my water pots in here as a little reminder. You're going to want a paper that's heavy enough to absorb a little bit of water. So this is the Derwent watercolor pad. It's 300 GSM hot press paper. Hot press means that it's really smooth, so it's going to take nice smooth marks. But the 300 GSM, that's 140 pounds for anyone that's in the US. That's a paper that's nice and heavy and suitable for water-based materials. So that's going to be a nice thing to use. So I'll just make sure that's clear that that's what I'm using. And I'm just going to bring my kitchen roll in here and my water pots into the side. And just to have a look at the tip of that water brush, I'm using the large one of the different water brushes that come in the water brush set. But you can see, compared to my thumb, it's a relatively small brush as far as watercolor brushes go, just so that we can stay nice and contained for this tutorial. So I'm going to pop that up the top there. And I'm just going to bring in some of the materials to actually start making some marks. So with this one, I'm going to just pop the block there. So we've got the Excel block. The main quality of these blocks is that they're big. So they're going to be something that sit comfortably in your hand and allow you to make big, broad marks on the page. So what I'll invite everyone to do is just to take a piece of scrap paper. So I've just got some scrap watercolor paper there, and I'm going to start to make some abstract marks on the page. So I'm going to start off first with a mark that is the full breadth of the material. So a really big, broad mark. I'm pushing down harder on one edge just to try and get a really sharp edge out of it. And I've put a little bit less pressure on the middle and the other edge, so that we've just got a kind of little line there, but some open space in between. It's really worth playing around with seeing what kind of marks you can make from this. And if you want a really even mark, you might find you need to scrub the block against the paper to wear down one side so that it makes a flatter block of tone. But I wanted to give you a really kind of clear idea of the edge there and a little bit of a gradient coming in. So I put more pressure into this side. So that's a big broad mark on the page. I'm going to bring some of the blue in next, and I'm going to use the end of the blue to make a mark, kind of square a mark with the end of the block across the page, just to get a feel for that. And then I'm going to make a bit of a scribble with the corner of the yellow. So this is with the sun yellow. So I'm just going to make a bit of a scribble across the page just to use that finer edge as well. And then I think the magic bit, so I think this is always the exciting bit when you're using Inktense, particularly adding a bit of water to it. So obviously you can draw with them as a dry material. It's absolutely fine to use them dry like this. But if you add water to them, that brings out the best qualities of the material. I can add water just by pressing the water brush there, but I am actually going to dip in just to get lots onto my brush. So I'm going to start to move the material around on the page. So that's going to allow the blue and the red to mix to make a muted purple. I'm going to clean that off in my cleaning pot. And then I'm going to go across to the red here just to get the pure red, just to see what that looks like. So I'm liquefying it on the page. And then I'm just going to go into the yellow as well and just move some of that around. So add, oh, I didn't clean my brush very well there. There we are, cautionary tale for everyone. Do make sure you clean your brush properly between colours. Just move that around a little to get some of the water-soluble qualities out of the material, to get that down on the paper. Now, one of the things I'm using these for, in addition to making marks and then liquefying them, is actually using them as their own little paint pans. So if I add water to the top of the XL block, I'm using it like a gigantic paint pan. And then I can go straight on and actually start to paint with that material. That's where you'll get the really dense Inktense color. And if I put water straight down on the page, it's actually just going for relatively clean water, and then join that up with that pool of red, or even just drop little bits of red into it. Then you can move it around, start to kind of play with it on the page as you might with watercolor. You could apply any watercolor-like processes and techniques to using the Inktense blocks in this kind of way. And one thing you might find helpful is to have something like a hairdryer on hand. I've actually got one here. I probably won't need to use it myself. I might at some point. Just a regular domestic hairdryer to actually dry some of the wet Inktense marks between layers. It's worth noting, when this has dried, it's going to be permanent on the page, so it won't come off again with more water. That's really helpful for layering up, but it's worth knowing it before you start, just so that you understand that you won't be able to loosen up that material afterwards. So I'm going to get a little bit of the yellow. It's going to add some of that to the page as well. And now you want to just play around with making marks without having the pressure of actually creating an image at first. So it's always a good idea when you're using new materials to have one of these kind of play sheets going, somewhere where you can just make marks, experiment with what happens when you make dry marks back into wet marks, what happens when you add water to the page in different ways. And one of the nice things about these blocks, because they're so durable, is that you can add water to the top of the block, and then you can actually use the block itself as almost like a little springboard for all sorts of different kind of splattering marks.
Love that.
I know. I make such a mess, Claire, I tell you. Like the state of my studio at the minute with splatters of Inktense everywhere. There's a reason why I haven't worn a white shirt today.
Good plan.
I mean, it's great that the Inktense paints onto fabric, but then it doesn't come out of the fabric. So wear an apron if you can, or a waistcoat. And the other quite fun thing to play around with is the grating. So I introduced the teeny tiny nutmeg grater earlier. If you actually just grate the block directly onto the paper, you're going to get the powdered material onto there. And then you can add water to that powdered material and it will liquefy on the page. So you can play around with all sorts of different effects with that as well. It does work pretty well to actually put clean water down on the paper and then to grate straight into it and just to let it liquefy. We've got all three colors mixing there, so that does get a little duller. So in these playing pages, I'd only ever keep three colors going if I were you.
Jake, just a quick question that might interest everybody. Sorry. One of the participants wanted to know whether you'd used any watercolor mediums like Oxgal or Gum Arabic with the Inktense XL blocks.
Now, that's an interesting question. I haven't used them. So I haven't added any of those to any materials myself. Having used the Inktense for lots of other purposes, though, I would imagine it behaves in a very similar way to watercolor with those additives. So if you're using them as if they were a watercolor pan, they should behave in the same way as you'd expect a watercolor paint to behave with those additives in there. I think that's helpful.
Thank you. And then somebody else has asked whether you've tried using the blocks with fabric.
Well, I did accidentally when I got loads on my white shirt and then couldn't clean it out. And then I did deliberately when I was trying to make my own tote bag. So I took a tote bag, just a clean, plain cotton one, and then I liquefied and then painted with the Inktense blocks onto the tote bag. And if it's not washed on a hot wash, if it's just washed on a colder wash, then it does actually stay in for plenty of washes as well. So it will be a permanent addition to fabric. So when it's painted on, yes, it does work really nicely on fabric, and I've tried that out myself. So I'd recommend everyone gives that a go as well. Now, I'm going to pop that off to the side. So I'm just going to take that away, and do keep jumping in, everyone, with any questions if you've got any. And thank you, Lisa and Claire and Anna for managing all of those.
Jake, I was just going to ask you about drying
yes.
times as you moved that page to the side. So if you wanted to just let that dry before you added any layers, if you're going to let it dry naturally, how long would you leave that?
I would leave it to dry naturally. I'd leave it overnight just to be really safe.
Yeah.
But for making these commissions, I had to turn everything around quite quickly. I had to make many drawings as well. So what I was doing was I was drying them with a hairdryer, and then we've got really minutes. So I was letting it dry naturally for about 10 minutes. So just letting it settle into the paper. Then once the sort of surface water had seeped into the paper, then I was using a hairdryer on it. If you use the hairdryer too soon, then you might actually blow the water or the color over the page. But once it had settled in, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on how wet it was, then the hairdryer over the top, couple of minutes of running the hairdryer over it until it is visibly dry. Then it's absolutely fine to work over the top after that. So if you've got something to artificially dry it with, then it should be pretty quick.
Brilliant, thank you.
And that was definitely something that I borrowed from Tom Shepherd, who's a wonderful watercolor artist, friend of mine, who did recommend that I did that. And it's a great watercolor tip as well. I think any water-soluble material, hairdryer on hand, is always good. Now, I'm going to just take everyone through actually adding this to an image. I've started with a line drawing here. So this is one that I circulated to people. If not everyone has it, so particularly anyone that's joined the workshop at a later date and would like a copy of it, then you can pop me a message on Instagram, or I'm sure we can find ways of getting that out to you as well. So do feel free to message me directly, and I'll be able to make that available to you as something you can print out. I have actually made a copy. So this is actually a line drawing that I made especially for this workshop, but based on the image that I used for the tin artwork. And it's just a very simple line drawing that I've then photocopied onto watercolor paper. So it's actually just been printed onto watercolor paper, just as a starting point, just as a kind of springboard. If you wanted to actually make the drawing yourself, then you're welcome to draw from the reference image of Inej, who was the inspiration for the tin artwork. So do feel free to draw just visually, freehand. That was how I made the commission. But also do feel free to use this if you have it. If you don't have it, just have a good play. Just try the materials out and don't worry too much about making something representational. Because our focus is on materials here, I'm not going to tell you how I arrived at this line drawing. So that's something that you might want to experiment with a little bit yourself, with portrait drawing as a slightly separate consideration. What I'm just going to look at is adding color to this. So we're just going to use this as a starting point and add color one block at a time. So I'm going to start off with the yellow. Now, this is just one little note. As you're switching between colors, it's easy, if you've got bad painting practices like I have, to get one color on top of another. So I've just got a little bit of red contaminating the yellow there. And just to stop that affecting any of the work, I'm just going to take a little bit of dampened kitchen roll and just wipe some of that off. It's also worth noticing that makes the block a little bit damp, which is going to make it behave slightly differently. So I'm also just going to let that dry for a moment before I make any marks with it, just for sort of 30 seconds or so. And what I'm going to do is just play around with some different marks on this surface. I'm going to work in layers from the lightest color first. So this is from the yellow first. And I'm going to use the broad edge here just to put a big stroke in down the side of Inej's face. So that's just going to be a big stroke kind of coming out from the side. I'm going to work in both directions. Just going to scrub that across the page. I'm going to use this as a reservoir of color then to drag across the paper with the water-soluble material. But what I really like is that that breadth of mark becomes an interesting design addition in itself. So that's something that's worth kind of exploring and playing around with, how these big, broad marks that you can make with these blocks can create these sort of designed shapes in a drawing. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of water using the clean water here. So I'm just going to dip into that. And I'm going to go straight onto the yellow, liquefying it. And then I'm going to start to move it across the page. So as the liquefied paint, I'm just going to move it relatively freely across the paper, and I'm just going to cover both eyes. So this is just recreating the image from the front of the tin, just moving it across to there. One thing I've got in the corner of the tin as well is a whole load of little butterflies, sort of playful little butterflies that I kind of added in as a bit of an imaginative addition, because Inktense is all about imagination, trying to kind of spark a more playful way of working. I thought that would be something appropriate. Now, I'm not going to add the butterflies in for now, but if you wanted to kind of play around with that yourself, you can. What I am going to do, though, is to just try out some of the splatter in the corner. So I'm just going to splatter a little bit of the yellow straight off the block into the corner up there as well. Now I want some of this to dry so that I can work over the top of it. So this is actually where I'm going to bring the hairdryer in. I'm going to very briefly mute myself, but this will kind of go back to Claire's question. This is going to dry just visibly, so it's going to dry just a little bit as the paper soaks it up, but I'm not too worried that it's too wet at the moment. So I'm going to go straight in and put the hairdryer over the top. So you'll see the hairdryer moving around, but I'm going to briefly mute myself while I'm doing that.
Nice, thanks, Jake. I don't know if anyone is hair drying. We got anyone hair drying whilst hair drying along? That would be a first for one of our workshops.
So one thing I haven't seen is art hair dryers as something specific. I mean, I guess you kind of just get it with any old hair dryer, it works. It's also quite nice, actually, when it's a chillier day, as it is here in North Wales at the moment, just to have a little blast with a hairdryer just to warm yourself up. Now, I'm going to go on to some of the hair next, and I'm going to use the blue block. So this is with the blue XL block there. And I'm going to, this is the bright blue. I think there are some specific questions about color names, so I should be more precise. I'm going to make some marks with the end of the block with this one. And so I'm going to go straight into Inez's hair. I'm going to just try and keep these marks nice and energetic and respond to the shape of the hair, leaving the white of the page behind where needed. So with Inez's ear, for example, I'm going to try and work around that. I'm going to also make a really nice clear mark for the neck, so something good and bold and playful. And I'm just going to switch between using the broad edge of the block. In fact, I might even use the broadest edge of the block. It's going to make quite a big mark, the end of the block and the corner of the block, really sort of putting some oomph into it. So this is where having the big material helps, because you can put weight into the mark in a way that would snap a conventional pencil, and the smaller Inktense blocks that are also in the Inktense range, where those might snap with a little bit more weight, these are going to remain nice and strong on the page. And with the hair, I'm going to make some slightly more playful marks. I'm not going to try and be too strictly representational, just try and respond to the feel and the quality of the hair. And I'm going to go into the yellow as well. So this is some of the yellow that's still a little bit wet. So there's going to be a little bit of a degree of mixing going on in that. And then coming down the side of Inez's cheek, just a few little marks there. And I'll leave that there. And then I'm going to add some more water in. So this is just a bit of further liquefaction. I'm going to also have this on hand just as a little water, as a little pan, so like a little reservoir. And as I've got so much material down now, you'll see as I'm liquefying it, actually it's a really quite a dark, intense color. If I did want to make it more intense, then I'm going to add a little bit more water to the block, and then I'm going to drop some of that in as well. And I might add a few little splatters into here as well, just for the sake of playfulness. And this is where you can start to combine the effects of the drawn mark, so the mark that you kind of initially made, with the kind of wet mark that we're adding right now, with marks that bring out some of the textures of the paper. As this is a relatively untextured paper, it's just my personal preference. I quite like a nice clean mark going straight down on the page without too much texture. It's obviously not bringing out too much of the texture of the paper, but if your preference is for something a little bit more heavily textured, then that's something that's going to be brought out in your brush strokes and in the strokes that you make with the mark. Now, with something like the ear, I'm going to add clean water into the space that Inez's ear fills, so that then as I hit the Inktense around the edge, it's just going to gently seep into that space. I'm going to try and let the medium do a little bit of the work for me. I'm terrible for trying to over control my materials. And so actually, this is really healthy for me. I think using water-soluble materials and using something like an Inktense block definitely encourages me to be more playful, less fiddly with my mark making. I'm just going to drag a little bit of blue down into the shape of Inez's jaw just down there as well. I'm also going to add some marks back over the top of the water. And again, that's where the robustness of the block can be helpful. You'll notice there's a slightly different quality to the mark. It's kind of thicker, it's darker, it's a little bit more impactful, and you can feel it sliding across the page in a slightly different way as well. So then I'm going to go back and forth between those. And if you are working along with me at the moment, do just kind of enjoy the tactile quality of what that's doing and how it feels as you make those marks on the paper. And add a few little splatters into that corner as well. And then there are some bigger droplets. I'm just going to tap the brush just to bring a few of those in. So this is just tapping the brush like this on top, just to bring a few larger marks into there. Some of the really big drips as well, that can come from just adding water to the brush, to the block, sorry, and then just letting it flick down. Now, if you are being a little bit more precise with this, that's absolutely fine. But I'm just trying to encourage this attitude of playfulness, of messing around with the materials. Now, the next color I'm going to add in is red. So I'm going to add some red to this side of the face. I am actually going to eventually add a little bit more blue to the features up here, but I'm going to give this eye a little bit longer to dry, as I was pretty swift with my hair drying there. I might just give it a moment longer to properly dry on the page. If it hasn't fully dried, then it will still move around. If it has fully dried, then it will be permanent on the paper, and you'll get a feel for what that means as you're using it. Now, this is where I'm going to put quite a bit more detail into the work. You'll notice, looking at the original image, so if we have a look at the tin artwork here, there's a lot of detail in this side of the face, but a lot of this side is really quite open, and then all of the blue, all of the yellow is really quite playful and expressive. So this is where I'm going to be a little bit more careful with my mark making. I had someone question me the other day on whether I'd really used Excel blocks for it because it looked too precise. I definitely did, don't worry. So all of it was made with Excel blocks and just a water brush for those. So everything that we're using right now, and I'll just show you how. So this is really just using the Excel block as a paint pan. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to the page. So I'm going to add water first before I actually put any of the paint down. So I'm going to add some of this in here and make sure my brush is clean first, bad habits. I'm going to add a little bit of water straight down. There we go. And everywhere that I want it to be red, so everywhere that I'm ultimately going to put red down, I'm going to add a little bit of water to right now, so that then it starts to move across the page once the red goes down on the paper. And this little highlight in Inez's lipstick there, I'm going to leave white. So I'm going to try and skirt around that. And I notice actually this brush is picking up just a little bit of the water-soluble ink from the printing. So I'm just going to try and leave that as an open space. And then I'm going to add some of the red in. So I might start adding it now, actually. Now, a little bit might blend a tiny bit with some of this yellow where it's still a little bit wet from earlier. But we'll just see how that goes. Again, It's playing around. It's seeing how it behaves. Oh, now we see it moving through the water. This is one thing that I really enjoy, the way that it kind of moves and spreads out.
That's a lovely effect.
Isn't it glorious?
Yes, it really is.
Oh, because you get these really lovely precise marks where you're going down on the clean, dry paper, but where you go down on the water, oh, it just flows. It's delightful. I'm a relatively inexperienced watercolorist. I mean, it's drawing really that is my passion. And so these water-soluble colored pencils were definitely my bridge into using color more confidently. But these blocks are kind of a really nice way into using a drawing material, something that feels like a drawing material. It almost feels kind of like a stick of charcoal or something in the hand, you know, big, chunky medium, a bit more like a painting tool. And so using these for kind of painting adjacent processes and materials. So it's helping me be a little bit more playful with my art making. And let the medium do a little bit more work for us as well. Now, I don't know how many other people are actually working along at exactly the same time. So if anyone's coming across any particular challenges, do feel free to pop your questions or your queries, or just share your frustrations or successes as you're going. So if anyone has anything they'd like to share, do ask away, do kind of add your thoughts into the chat and into the Q&A, because I'd love to hear how you're doing at the same time. In fact, that goes for Claire and Lisa and Anna and Justine as well. If you guys are working along, I don't know if you are.
I'm not. I'm very happily watching you and thinking you're making it look very easy. I'm not sure it is. So I'd love to hear how everyone else is getting on.
So Jake, we've had a comment from a lady saying she's keeping up with you, but she's using the smaller version rather than the XL block. So
oh, great. Well, they're a lovely material to use as well. Just the Derwent blocks are great. I mean, that was what I used for a few years, obviously before these came out. So if anyone is using just the regular Derwent blocks, you can't put quite as much oomph behind them, but essentially you'll be able to apply a lot of the same approaches. I'm actually, for my kind of day-to-day practice, when I'm using Inktense materials, so when I'm using the pencils, I've now got the pencils, the blocks, so the smaller blocks, and these big XL blocks. I've got all of them to hand at the same time, so that I can just switch between using one and the other as I wish. So I would recommend, you know, sort of building up that little family of materials if you want the full range of different marks, because then that just gives you lots of different options to use. Lovely. And I don't know, I mean, so Claire, have you used, do you draw much yourself, Claire, as well? This is probably putting you on the spot.
No, I try, and when we had workshops, I have a go. Actually, and one of the ones I really enjoyed that we did a little while ago now was using the Inktense pencils. Because you could add water and blend. For me as a beginner, I found that fabulous and forgiving. So I felt a bit braver and a bit more confident starting out with those. Would you suggest, you talked about using the pencils and the blocks and the XL blocks, is that as a beginner, would you suggest a preference of where to start, or do you think just have a go with the different materials?
I think it depends on what scale you want to be working. If you want to go bigger, then this is something that can be really nice and playful for kind of scaling up a little bit. And I think sometimes the bigger materials, they're not harder to use. They just create a different range of marks. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a sort of experience or ability thing, but I think it would relate to what kind of work you're wanting to make, what scale you're wanting to work at. And the Inktense pencils can be an affordable way of kind of starting out, you know, just starting out with one or two pencils or a small set, seeing whether you enjoy them, seeing whether you enjoy making marks with them, whether you enjoy that kind of working. And then if you do, sort of adding to them with these bigger materials. But then I think also that there's kind of it's like a kind of grown-up child's crayon that we're using. You know, it's something that encourages that sense of playfulness, but you know, it should be accessible to anyone. I mean, I'm always a fan of getting really good quality materials into kids' hands, which I know is sort of contentious, because then you've got to spend lots of money on fancy materials. But just, I mean, I did a children's workshop with the Inktense blocks once, just with the regular blocks. And being able to use such strong colors, I mean, some of the older children that I think had mostly only used really cheap school materials, they were creating some incredible work, because I think it was the first time they were using properly pigmented, you know, artist quality materials, and I think it made a real difference. So I would always say, don't limit yourself with materials. You know, obviously work within what you can afford, but try everything that you can get your hands on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I showed the Inktense pencils to my children, just the concept of that wetting and blending, and I blew their minds. Mine are relatively small when I show up. So yeah, it's a good thing to do. Someone else has just mentioned they've given the Inktense blocks to their teenager, so that should be interesting.
That is generous as well, very generous.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, and obviously they're not averse to too much mess going on either. As someone else has just mentioned, actually, that Inktense is popular in the quilting world.
I have heard this.
Oh, yeah, but I haven't. That's fascinating.
I mean, I don't know much about the quilting world. I don't know about you, Claire, but what goes on in the quilting world?
No, I don't know. I don't know if the person's just shared would like to share a little bit more about that. I don't want to put them on the spot. But apparently mainly the pencils, and the being able to print with them as well.
Ah, interesting. So I wonder whether this might have its own application in that case. I mean, being able to add a lot more material, because I presume it's because they're washable.
Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it? As you saying with your tote bag example.
Something you could draw with onto a material that you could then wash. I'm just going to say, I'm going to start dripping a few bits in here, just playfully. Oh, if you do find that you over drip and you want to take some of that out, all the while it's still wet, again, you can apply watercolor-like techniques. So you could just take a little bit of kitchen roll and you can just take some of that out. So you can always erase back into it while it's all still wet. And you can still flood that surface with water while it's wet to get it moving around again. So if you do find you make marks where you don't intend them to go, just wet it again and then use a little while it's still wet, and then use a little bit of kitchen roll just to lift it out.
Jake, another quick query. Obviously you've used most of the Inktense, well, probably all of the Inktense in the range, but have you used a dip pen when creating art with them?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I have not. I would imagine that. So, okay, so if you're using a dip pen, you would want a decent amount of liquefied material first. So what you might then want to do is actually this is probably a good moment for it. Is just to scrape off some of the material into a little pot. So I'm just going to scrape some of that off into there and then add water to it so that you've got something really nice and intense. So you had a kind of a pot of ink then, essentially. And then actually use that to move around, to actually draw with the dip pen. But that should work just fine. You would probably need to put quite a lot of material into that pot before you could effectively draw with it, because you'd want it to be really lovely and rich and intense. So I would say don't skimp with your scraped off material, but it should work just fine with a dip pen. I don't see why it wouldn't. But I haven't done it myself, I must say.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take a moment as well to add in a few marks over the top of this dry material. So this is going over the top of the yellow that was down earlier. I'm just going to make a few relatively clear, sharp marks. So using the corner of the block, you can get a really sharp, clear mark out of it, out of the Excel block. And I'm just going to add few little extra bits that I'm then going to liquefy as well. So I'm also just going to use the block a tiny bit to actually use as a reservoir. And this is where you'll see that it isn't mixing with the yellow because the yellow is already fixed. So because that's dried with the hairdryer, that's staying where it is. And we're getting a nice bit of optical mixing where the blue is layered over the yellow. And so any kind of greenishness is coming from that layering rather than coming from it actually mixing. So that's something you can play around with, actually using these to layer in a slightly different way to how you might use watercolor, which does tend to lift off if you start using it. So that's a difference with Inktense that you might want to explore if you're used to using watercolor-like material, that it's going to be able to layer quite effectively like that.
That is creating quite a different color to the blue. I know the other blue's dried a little bit now, but that is having quite a different effect. It's fantastic.
It is, and it's one of those things that I kind of wish everyone could see it in real life, because there's a bit more subtlety without the harshness of the lighting coming through. So I'm hoping as well. Well, I always hope actually with these things that other people are making something much better than I am, which is often the case. It's always so exciting to see what anyone else has made with these materials. And I will share, as we come up towards the end, I'll share some Instagram links if anyone's on Instagram and wants to share their artwork with us. It would be really lovely to see after the workshop. So I'll share some links to the Cult Pens and Derwent and my Instagram if you wanted to tag us all in any work that you're sharing, because that is always a joy to see.
I think we might also quite like to see some of the quilting that people are talking about as well. So if there's other materials that have been used as the base, it'd be marvellous to see those as they've come up in the chat. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, Claire, I met quite a few ladies that use them in theatrical purposes. So they have their costumes and then they design all, everything using Inktense on the costumes. So, there's quite a few applications, quilting obviously being one of them.
Wow. So maybe for next year we could do a Halloween themed Inktense workshop.
I like it. That's great. I'm also wondering what is the strangest thing? I mean, given that people seem to have some experience with Inktense pencils, what's the strangest thing anyone's tried to paint onto? Because I've done a plant pot in Inktense before, but that doesn't feel too wild. Wonder if anyone's got any particularly strange surfaces or materials that they've worked on Inktense with. Maybe not, though. I don't know.
No, wood is good, Jake. Actually, one of our ambassadors, she had some blocks of wood and she put tea lights in the top of them, and then she used Inktense to personalize all the wooden blocks. So they look good.
Excellent. There you go. That's another challenge for everyone to come and share with us as well. The strangest thing that you've used Inktense blocks or pencils to draw onto. That's a good challenge.
A couple of people are mentoring frames, which is a nice idea. It's a lovely idea, isn't it, to actually put that onto a frame? And someone else has tried metal.
Oh,
so that's good. Like, again, love to see the results of that if you're happy to share.
Fantastic, because normally I would always go for something porous where it's actually going to be able to kind of seep into a layer. So I'll be interested to know how it went on the metal, how they found it, whoever's sharing that.
So Claire, I'm going to put you on the spot now because somebody's asked whether we'll have more of these types of sessions, but rather than just using paper, having different materials. So I think me and you need to put our heads together.
Definitely. Well, perhaps if everyone wants to share, that will give us some ideas of what materials we can play with next. Someone has painted some tarot cards. That is amazing, using Inktense. Love it.
I want to see those. Brilliant. Well, I'm coming close to the end of this particular demonstration. I mean, it's a bit of a playful and a messy one. So I'm going to add a few final marks to this, and then I'm going to draw this particular image to a close. But I'm also going to have some blank paper if anyone wants to see anything specific, or if you want to ask particular questions, do fire away. So I'll look forward to hearing about that. So I'm just going to make some final marks on here over the top of the marks I've already made. So using the corner of the block just to add some slightly more playful scribbles on, and doing the same with a few different colors as well.
And Jake, obviously you've done this within the hour, which is incredible. When you did the artwork that is actually on the front of the tin, how long did you take to do that piece?
It was interesting because I wanted the marks to feel very fresh. So I didn't want to take too long about it, because actually that can really sort of kill the energy of it. So it was more that I had to do it many times, Claire. So I did.
I put you on the spot there with Derwent on the call as well.
Oh, no, well, it's good. They see me work. I think Lisa's seen me working live plenty as well. I spent, so it was interesting. Yeah, it's a great question always as well. How long do things take to make? It's really important. I think the work itself, so the commission itself, probably took about 3 hours, start to finish. But I spent quite a few different sort of trial drawings, actually trying different poses, so trying different faces, different people, and playing around with those. So that was sort of a day of experimenting, finding the right line drawing to start with. And then after that, it was very much about playing around with all these different marks and trying to find a nice rhythm over the whole image. So I did about 6 different versions of this same face that didn't work as well. And then I picked the one that I was most pleased with. So let's say a couple of days overall, but really only 3 hours on a single piece, but many times. So I think that's always the trick.
Little bit of perseverance then to get the result that you wanted in the end.
Yeah, and I always think, you don't always think actually it's not all about putting loads of time into one image. A lot of the time it's about developing an idea, and sort of playing around with developing an idea, and actually that development of the idea can often take longer than the work itself. And I think there's a lot of value to the work feeling playful and feeling expressive and interesting. And so often that means making it quickly if you can. So it's, not always about fiddling around on a single piece. Sometimes it is about trying to put more energy into the work.
That's a lovely thing for people to think about.
Now I'm going to finish off about there. Should have left some final flourishing mark to make with this one. But I'm going to leave it there. In fact, I'm going to put a bit of splatter, just because it's the most fun thing to do. So just splattering straight off the block into the corner there. There we are. I'll leave that there. And I'm just going to pop the Instagram links that I mentioned a moment ago. I'm just going to pop those into the chat. But again, if I just invite everyone, if you've got any further questions that you want to ask, fire away. So let me know if there's anything that you wanted to know about this, about the commission, about Excel blocks in general. Any further questions? Oh.
Silence, Jake.
I mean, hopefully that's a good sign, right? I just put the links in there. So do tag us all, tag Cult Pens, tag Derwent, tag me as well. Jenny says, can you use wax resist with them? Yes, you can. So I don't know if anyone else has done this. I mean, the Inktense materials are quite a waxy material in themselves, but in how they feel, but they're not waxy in terms of sort of resisting water. They're fully water soluble. So don't get your materials muddled up. But if you've got a wax material, so something like a candle, or it could be a wax crayon, you can draw down on the page, particularly if it's white or if it's something quite light, and then you can add watery material to that. So you could use the liquefied Inktense over the top of it, and it's going to resist. So anywhere that you've drawn the waxy material over the top, then the water isn't going to fill in that area. So sorry, that's explaining it. Obviously, Jenny, you'll understand that. But for anyone else, you can use wax resist with the Inktense materials, but only using them when they're already liquefied. So when you use them like a paint pan, that's the best time to use them for a wax resist. And that does work very well. All right, any other questions, anyone? Thank you all. It's lovely to be seeing everyone's comments as well. Thanks, Dean, Yvette. Busy concentrating, of course. Excellent. Alison, thank you. And Karen and Rosie, all of these lovely people that are, sorry, everyone I'm missing as well here. Great. Well, I think in that case, I'm going to draw things to a close there. Claire, Lisa, was there anything you wanted to add in before we finish?
No, I think that was fantastic, Jake. Thank you so much. There's lots of love in the chat. So I hope everyone is brave with what they've been creating and does share it, because we'd love to see what everyone's been creating if you've been drawing along with Jake this evening. But also quilting, any fabrics, weird materials. We would love to see all of it, because it will potentially inspire us to do another session and using a different surface. So please do share. We'd love to see it all. And if you think of any other questions, then get in touch with Jake, with Derwent, with us. We're always happy to help. So thank you so much, Jake, for doing the session. It's brilliant.
Thank you, Jake. It's been great.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you everyone for coming. It's been a joy. So I hope you can get your hands on some of these and have a good play around with them. And I look forward to seeing everyone's work. So please do share it with me.